Hello.
Well, welcome to Leonard Peikoff Lectures with James Valliant. I am honored. Amy is honored. We are honored, the Nasirs, to be invited to co-host James Valliant's outstanding series on Leonard Peikoff's lectures. And today, have we got a good one for you? James and us will be talking about the spirit of the 60s.
The 1960s.
That sounds like a party. That sounds like Woodstock and music and Beatles and Beach Boys and all that good stuff. Except what we need to look at is, what did the 60s mean in terms of where we ended up in the 70s, the 80s, the 2020s, this week of Ukraine news, and what does the impact of philosophy have to do with all of that? So James, this lecture, The Spirit of the 60s, originally published in the Objectivist Forum, but this was an excerpt of the book that Leonard Peikoff was writing, The Ominous Parallels. So anybody who doesn't have a copy of the Objectivist Forum, you can find it in The Ominous Parallels, chapter 15 there. And
it's slightly different. He still was doing some edits between 1980 and 1982, as we were discussing before we came on the air. But it is available, and it is one of, I can not recommend The Ominous Parallels highly enough. It is probably the best culture discussion of American culture that you can find, even to this day, which is now 40 years on in celebrating. It's this year, 2022, is the 40th anniversary of the publication of The Ominous Parallels, and in my mind, it still remains the best discussion of American culture, contemporary culture. You're right, the 60s, people look back on the 60s with sort of kind of a romantic, gauzy, sort of hazy view of things, and they think of it in terms of liberation from old, religious sexual morality, the sexual revolution, or they think of it as expression of personal freedom and individuality, sort of a liberating moment in American culture. And after all, were the goals of the hippies, were the goals of the activists in the 60s really concretely different than Ayn Rand's? And from a devil's advocate standpoint, one could say Ayn Rand opposed the Vietnam War, just like they did. Ayn Rand very much opposed traditional gender roles for women. I mean, look at Dagny Taggart and Atlas Shrugged running a transcontinental railroad. Her magazine had even positively reviewed Betty Friedan's Feminine Mystique, an early feminist work. I'll go so far as even to say Ayn Rand advocated legalizing drugs. So in effect, weren't many of her policy prescriptions the very same goals that the hippies of the 60s had?
And it is that idealized 60s that I think some of us still cling to. Peace and love. What's wrong with peace? What's wrong with love? Isn't that mean putting values?
It's the Elvis Costello song.
Peace, love, and understanding. That's right. What could be wrong with that?
Right. But I think that one can advocate not going to war with Vietnam, or advocate something short of the draft, without doing what Jane Fonda did and go praise the Viet Cong and praise communism and communist expansion. I think one can advocate legalizing drugs without believing LSD is a tool of cognition and a mode to a higher awareness. I think that one can advocate, for example, women running heavy industry without throwing out standards of morality as such, which is in effect what the hippies were opposed to. So it's not, in effect, those policy conclusions that are the key here, but the underlying philosophical trend that it represented, the overt anti-reason trend that it represented. And for all the exalted claims of being radicals on the cutting edge, the 60s radicals were, in effect, the conditioned robots of their college professors, and everything that the professors had been teaching in great universities in the West for decades. What a lot of people also don't realize is that the 1960s was really just a replay, in many senses, of the 1920s, both on a micro scale in the Greenwich Village Rebellion, which advocated many of the same things the hippies would advocate 40 years later, but in most especially, and perhaps most tellingly, in Weimar Germany, pre-Nazi Germany. They had the equivalent, the exact equivalent of a hippie movement in the 1920s. And Dr. Peikoff has the presence of mind to understand that and to draw that comparison. It is the assault on reason that sort of binds those movements. And if you project up to our time, look at the violence, the so-called mostly peaceful protests of 2020 that were stimulated by, say, the Floyd and other police incidents. That violence was met nothing but sympathy on the part of media and academic. They were bailing people out for setting fire to police stations and hitting cops with bricks. So yeah, the more things change, the more they stay the same.
Yeah, that bankruptcy, the moral bankruptcy of the period, when we think about the idealized 60s, we forget about that. So if I could just read the first two paragraphs of that section from the Ominous Parallels, because when I reread this in preparation for this discussion, I forgot just how clearly Dr. Peikoff makes the point. He writes, the Eisenhower administration was an eloquent symbol of the start of this period. Although the intellectuals rejected Eisenhower, his presidency, in fact, was a monument to their growing belief that thought is futile, and to the consequences of this belief: uncertainty, lifeless routine, drift. The screams were the next phase. If thought is futile, one began to hear, then a replacement is necessary. If concepts lead to paralysis, there is another source of knowledge: passion. If the mind of the West has failed, there is a superior guide: the religions of the East. The quiet voices of the more civilized skeptics had prepared the way. They began to be drowned out by their natural successors. Reading that from Dr. Peikoff reminds me, well, the 60s weren't about peace, love, and understanding. It wasn't all the Beach Boys and the Beatles and good times and be nice to each other. It was everything of the past is wrong. There is nothing to replace it, and we simply need to accept that and do our best to live by our emotions.
To summarize that idea, it was as though it was the first time that you had a major cultural movement in America that seemed to explicitly embrace nihilism. Mm-hmm. All standards have to be thrown out. Any authority has to be question authority was one of the slogans. Liberation didn't mean liberation merely from political oppression. Quite the reverse. In some cases, it meant the imposition of political oppression. What liberation meant to them was liberation from reason and reality. And the 60s, as Dr. Peikoff points out, had a giant drum roll in the 50s. This was the age when existentialism really hit the world culture smack in the face. This was the beatnik age, the age of beat poets by the time the decade was over. And it was characterized by a sense of moral crisis. You have the culture asserting itself, the conservative culture sort of asserting itself. You can see in the television programs and so forth. And that was this very this unrealistic, glossy view of American capitalism as far as they were concerned, which all needed to be questioned. Advertisements were evil, commerce was bad. Capitalism was the source of evil. We embrace people like Chairman Mao and Fidel Castro were giant heroes this time. Now, as Dr. Peikoff points out in the essay too, the 60s saw an accelerating assault on reason. But look at maybe the most famous professor at Harvard in philosophy at Harvard University at the time, Willard Van Orman Quine. He, as Dr. Peikoff points out, he said very famously that the distinction between physical objects and the mythological gods of Homer is really non-existent. They're really just the same. They're fictitious. They're just as mythological. This was America's leading philosopher at Harvard University at the time, simply articulating what you could commonly find from 20th century philosophers. You had physics students, as Dr. Peikoff points out, like at NYU, a physics course description was going to discuss how physics is an example of the inconsistencies of the world, when, of course, physics should be exactly the opposite. Physics is such a successful science. We land on the moon on a dime every time. Physics, our knowledge of the physical world has given us such power and control of that physical world, and yet you've got a physics student, a physics teacher from Harvard or Columbia, excuse me, teaching at NYU, saying that physical objects, like Willard Van Orman Quine, I guess, echoing here, are just as mythological. You've got students of physics studying the I Ching and tarot cards, as Dr. Peikoff points out. This is the rejection of reason from philosophers and physicists, people who should know better. And it's the undermining of reason that undermines all standards and all values and liberates these passions, liberates them. That's the kind of liberation that the 60s was going for, the liberation of passions from any constraints that reality or reason might impose. So culturally, as Dr. Peikoff again points out, you see the manifestations in pop art. You see the manifestations in absurdist drama, for example. And all over the place. In effect, America was going through an artistic phase very much like the Weimar Republic was in the 20s with its Dadaism. We were going through a period of pop art and Andy Warhol. Very similar in many ways. The hippie movement, the rise of extreme ideologies like communism, Maoism, Fidel Castro. That all can't be denied as the ugly side of the 1960s. And it has philosophical roots that go back to German philosophy. It was this invasion of German ideas, the ideas of philosophers like Marx and Hegel and Freud that really shaped the ideas of the 20th century. So you'd get Marxist Freudian analysis of everything, the psychotherapeutic view on Leon Trotsky or the childhood development of Chairman Mao, or something. You'd have analyses like that, which were the cutting edge of thought. And of course, the villain behind all that is ultimately Immanuel Kant, the first philosopher who really dispensed with reality as such. He had a theoretical reality, a noumenal world, but he said things in themselves couldn't really be known. And reason is all just a matter of illusion, in effect, producing a merely phenomenal reality in our consciousness. And reality itself can never be known. Our means of knowing are, in fact, an obstacle to knowing. And philosophy, of course, was downhill from there. American education and American philosophy in particular was dramatically influenced by German philosophy. Pragmatism, in effect, the pragmatism of William James and John Dewey is really just an echo of German philosophy, as Dr. Peikoff demonstrates and is rather well known.
Yeah, he writes in every area from paintings of Brillo boxes. See, these are things that I remember and are still in the museums today. Paintings of Brillo boxes, to actors stuffing their heads into toilet bowls on stage, to quote unquote dances performed by thalidomide victims, to bloody campus riots, to scholars kissing thugs. The spirit of the 60s was a culmination, which had been made possible by earlier trends.
Yeah, I'd like to stop here and thank Jonathan Honig. Thank you so very much for the $3.99 super chat. And yes, I think, when I just also want to ask for those people in the chat who are younger than us, perhaps. I was born in 1973, so I kind of missed the 60s, but I basically know what it's about. But if you, for instance, when I was younger, I would have colleagues, coworkers, and college professors telling me things like, nothing is really real because when you get down to the atomic level, everything is space, or some nonsense like that.
Nothing.
Yeah. And so does anybody is anybody experiencing that same kind of thing when you converse with your professors or adults in your lives, people who are older than you? Do they give you the same line of BS? Or are people, what do you think? Are people a little bit more rational nowadays in terms of their explicit philosophical ideas about metaphysical realities? And also, I want to point out in terms of political, what are these rebels, in the 60s? What was their plan? What was their positive assertion?
Well, there's a great quote on that.
Yeah, there's a quote. And yeah, so it says, there was a youth leader named Tom Hayden in 1968 who said, do you want to say it? Jimmy?
Make the revolution first, and we'll figure out why later. What for later? He wanted the revolution now, and he didn't know why he would want the revolution yet. But once we get the revolution, then we'll figure out why we have the revolution. This is a classic example of everything. And Tom Hayden was a very famous radical activist. He was involved in many radical causes in the late 60s and 70s. He was at one time married to Jane Fonda. He ran for governor of California. He was an important political activist of the period. And there he is, explicitly saying he does not have an agenda of policies, much less ideas, principles, and he just wants revolution now, action now. And obviously, it can only be motivated by a philosophy of irrationality and liberating those passions from reason.
He also mentions, Leonard Peikoff mentions in the article that there was somebody who wanted the end of the selfish, quote, performance principle, which means working for a living. You've got, you don't want to have all of this on your shoulders, having to perform every day, to actually.
We talked before about how everything old is new again.
Now you have universal basic income.
Exactly.
We don't have to worry about this performance principle.
That's terrible. Why should people be burdened with? And again, a couple of years ago, you had a senator saying what? You had the I just lost our quote there. Oh yeah, we need to pass this legislation. We'll find out what's in it afterward. Those people nowadays.
She said Nancy Pelosi with Obamacare. You got to pass the bill, then we'll find out what's in it. It's very much echoes of Tom Hayden, isn't it?
Yeah, these people are pikers nowadays. In the late 60s, early 70s, they wanted to start a whole revolution with no idea what it was for. We'll find out afterwards. Afterwards, we'll find out what's in it.
See, if you reject reason, if you don't think that there can be a rational epistemology, ethics, and politics, you can't have a principled agenda. You can't have a rational agenda. And the philosophers that have been teaching these kids had taught them for years that reason is not going to get you to reality. Reason is not our means of knowing. And therefore, so what is? Instinct, feeling, gut, the communal spirit that arises magically when groups of people get together and emote, I guess. And so what you get is, if only, like you in our previous discussions for this, we were talking about Woodstock. If Woodstock had only been a music festival, if it really had been a professionally done music festival, at the end of the day, what you have is hungry people having overdoses, rolling in the mud, and turning into a giant destruction of local property. And that, I think, is the kind of cause and effect. You can see it there with what Amy was just saying. They want to be liberated from the cause and effect of having to work for a living, earn their own existence. And you can see that sort of same kind of anti-causal contempt for consequences, the need for planning, and that just exploded at Woodstock. It was just a disaster because these people were clearly, precisely because these people were not advocates of reason. They were advocates of instinct, passion, collective instinct. And the result is overdoses, rolling in the mud, and the mass destruction of property that we saw at Woodstock.
Yes.
A lot of the music at Woodstock I still listen to. I like some of that music. It's even more than, say, the Beach Boys or the Beatles that Ayn Rand could tolerate. Even stuff maybe that Ayn Rand didn't tolerate, I enjoy actually listening to. But if that's the only artifact that people have, is Janis Joplin or Jimi Hendrix or something, or Carlos Santana in their heads, they may have a very, very romanticized and foggy view of what the 60s really were.
Yes. Well, another quote from the essay here, Leonard Peikoff is quoting a writer in the New York Times. This was a college professor. And I have to read this because let me just read this. The professor is asking, why is the cult of irrationality, the rejection of all traditional norms, strongest precisely in the universities? Why are the students readiest for an apocalyptic leap into an inconceivable and unlikely future? Those who are now most immediately involved in the study of the humanities?
The
The
humanity.
answer is not simple. And Leonard Peikoff then says, the answer is virtually contained in the question. It is what those universities in their humanities departments are teaching the students. This is the power of ideas. This is why ideas need to be taken seriously.
And our radicals here really are just the conditioned robots, the dutiful, obedient students
Right.
of the professors who've been teaching them ideas in philosophy and the other humanities for the past 100 to 200 years at American universities. This is almost the inevitable result of it. And like I say, it was just a rerun in effect of the 20s from the Weimar Republic or from the Greenwich Village Rebellion. It's the same old attack on civilization at its very root.
Yeah. And what do you, I mean, what do you get if you are a student, you know, in the 60s or even nowadays, and you have no Ayn Rand in your awareness at the time, and you're confronted with all the subjectivity in all the different disciplines, all the different subject matters, all the different career choices. This one I was kind of shocked by with regard to psychiatry or psychology. There's a quote here by a Radcliffe girl approvingly saying this. R.D. Lang is one of the only ones in psychiatry that makes fantasy legitimate. He's not always knocking you over the head with reality.
Gosh.
I mean, how? I mean, really? You're going to basically you're just corrupting, you know, just destroying and decaying the minds of these people. And then, you know, once they're hooked on drugs, once they have no control of their lives, once they've completely abandoned reason, you're left with a psychiatrist who's going to encourage you to engage in fantasy.
At the exclusion of reality.
Yes.
Well,
yes.
Yeah, well, you know, there are Dr. Peikoff in another essay actually even cites a more contemporary psychologist who says that a certain amount of delusion is a good thing to instill the psychotherapy client or patient in.
Yes.
He should have an exaggerated view of self-esteem, an unrealistic view of himself. He should have an exaggerated sense of optimism. He should have a sense of control, which no one really ever has, because only that can give a person contentment, happiness, and avoid anxiety and depression. You need a good dose of fantasy and unreality if you ever hope to have a stable psychology. When you think about it for a second, what a person with psychological problems needs more than anything else is a big, giant reality check. And the worse the problem is, the more you need it. So that if you're a psychotic, you're actually losing touch with reality. And so what was so funny is the psychologist Dr. Peikoff was quoting in that context was someone who said, well, obviously, if they're going to be picked up and sent to a county psychiatric hospital because they're mumbling to themselves, on the street, while they're at that level, okay, they're detached from reality. But anything shy of that psychosis, they need a good injection of fantasy and unreality if they're going to be psychologically stable. Wow.
Right.
Yes.
And right after that, Leonard Peikoff gives us the quote from Immanuel Kant: I have therefore found it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. And you just think about the implications of that and the destructive implications on a person's psychology and their connection to themselves and reality.
Yeah. And that lecture, Modernism and Madness, is well worth hearing as well. And it's available online. Used to be hard to track that one down. You kids have it so easy these days.
Right. That is a brilliant essay because what it compares is the psychiatric illness of schizophrenia to modern philosophy. And there's nearly complete overlap.
Yes.
There's a substantial identity between the symptoms, the classic DSM symptoms of schizophrenia, and modern philosophy. And in the 60s, you could really see it coming out. The LSD, the dropout, this attack on causality, and the system as such. And by system, they didn't mean some corrupt part of the system. They meant that, like Amy was saying, the need to work for a living, right? The law of cause and effect is, in effect, what they want liberation from.
It's interesting that he winds down the passage by saying the students' teachers had miscalculated. They did not know why the country was shoving them and their discipline into the discard heap of history. They did not understand that the American people are not a Marxist proletariat, but the last heirs of the era of enlightenment left on earth. Eager to find a new direction, the people turned to the political right. There was no one there. All they found was Richard Nixon.
All right, I want to thank Jeff Bannister for the thank you super chat of, and also we have Bradley. He has kind of a comment question. So let's go for it. Let's see. There's evidence that political leaning has certain biological basis. In other words, liberals are creative, divergent thinkers. Conservatives are concrete, convergent. Perhaps the 60s was a pushback against a non-creative Christian mainstream.
Well, there were some elements of rebellion against, as you suggested, an earlier conservatism that was, say, sexually repressive, that denied women rights or proper roles in organizations, culturally, not politically, although there was some of that too. I'd be a little wary about how temperament aligns with political parties. I think there's something to that. I just don't think there's much to it.
I don't know how to classify you guys. How would I classify the Nasers by that?
Exactly.
I mean, I just don't see a way of. I just don't see a way of classifying us easily if that is in fact the case. I'm neither a conservative, nor am I a liberal, nor when I share any overlap with liberals or conservatives, am I of that psychological disposition and this psychological disposition. No, I think that thinking, it can really shape psychology, not the other way around. It's not that our psychology determines our principles. It's our principles determine our psychology, our emotions, our personality. The great revolution of cognitive behavioral psychology in our time, of which Ayn Rand was a pioneer, has taught us that in effect our emotions are cognitive in origin. Now, we may not always know this because it happens in early childhood. It could happen on a subconscious level when we're not fully conceptual yet. But nonetheless, it is evaluations that we make about ourselves and about the world that determine our dispositions. And so if our emotions do encourage one kind of politics or another, that's only a way of saying that deeper ideas are ultimately shaping those politics. But on the other hand, what you say is true. There were lots of things to criticize about the 60s and, traditional conservative religious cult, let's face it, in the Bible Belt in the 1960s, racism and sexism and hoary old religious fundamentalist ideas were still rampant in America. And so there is a sort of cultural pushback in the 1950s and 60s against that, against Christian conservatism. And you'll notice this relates to what you just said about Americans turning to the right. By the end of the 1960s, there was violence on college campuses. The American people were all for freedom of speech and they opposed the Vietnam War, but they drew the line at violence. There was racial violence in America's cities by the end of the 1960s. And there was a recoil on the part of the American people. And Richard Nixon in 1972 won a giant landslide against George McGovern. Now, how did Nixon do that? He did that by appealing to his silent majority, by adopting what's known as the Southern strategy and going for the cultural conservatives in the South, which had normally been the Democrats. The Democrats had dominated in the South up to that point. And it was picked up by Ronald Reagan, who embraced the moral majority and really brought the Bible Belt home for the Republican Party. So the reaction, in one sense, the reaction to the 60s against religion was part of what the American people were recoiling against. I think it wasn't just a negative thing. I think there was also a positive part of that. I think the American people, the positive part of the American sense of life was also rejecting the irrationality and the violence that was going on. And so the move to the right is sort of a mixed bag in my mind. Yes. It both is saying, we don't like how far you guys have taken this. So part of it is religious conservatism and cultural conservatism. But another part of it was just simply a reaction to violence, a reaction to the over-irrationality of the left. And again, the more things change, the more they stay the same. Have things really changed that much in the last 40, 50 years?
It's been an interesting progression watching the Reagan years, which again, like the 60s, I can look back on fondly if I don't think about Reagan 1976, Reagan creating the moral majority. And then through the 1990s, which I tend to think of as the last great political era, because despite Bill Clinton, we had the Republican Revolution in 94. And then we had the bizarrely bland years, even though there were war years of George W. Bush. But then you saw, once again, the American people in this backlash against statism and irrationalism with the Tea Party in 2010. And the sort of a version of that, what I consider to be a terribly handicapped version of that in 2016, with people saying that enough is enough. I don't care who this guy is. We're going to get behind him. So it's been interesting to watch that as the chapter is wrapped up with reference to Richard Nixon and Ronald Reagan.
Disgust is not emotion as never enough as a reaction.
Yes.
And if you go from being disgusted at one overreaction to disgusted at another overreaction to that reaction, which is in effect what we do. I mean, it's Bush who gave us Obama, in a sense, and Obama who gave us Trump, in a sense, and Trump who gave us Biden, in a sense. And this ugly tennis match of back and forth is an overreaction to an overreaction to an overreaction without anyone thinking through what are the principles, without anyone saying what's really going on here. And if you got going back to George Bush the Elder, his boring war years were a classic example of maybe the most naked example of raw pragmatism in American political history. He raised taxes. Why? Well, I had to think of the welfare of the American people and sacrifice my economic principles for that. What? If the American people's welfare is different than your economic, then why do you have those as economic? You don't know you don't have a principle if that's the way you're approaching things. And the allies of Bush were calling him the ultimate pragmatist. And so is Trump anything to be surprised at? No, of course not.
No.
He doesn't know liberty or rights if it bit him in the rear end.
No.
He would throw free trade out the door, and the very concept, the very lip service, at least the Republicans had given in some context to freedom, is now out the window with Trump. So it's been a steady decline based on the assault on reason and the march of pragmatism and irrationality. And it continues. It really just continues. Now, if people want some happy, good news, well, in the course of all that, there have been people like us.
Yeah.
There's objectivism. And I think it's a small but growing movement of people who recognize the need for reason and the need for rational principles to understand and deal with the culture, the politics, the world today. And just look at the way you bring up the war going on right now in Ukraine, and look at the West's pathetic reaction. That is, first of all, we should never have even come to this position, right? And as usual, it's getting to this position that is the horrible state. But here we are in this horrible state, faced with nothing but ugly alternatives, And again, what are people crying? They're crying emotion. They're not crying reason. And I was trying to be positive about it, but the truth is, when you look at the world today and you look at our policymakers, both right and left, they are without principle. And it is a return to reason and principle that really is our only hope.
I see some encouragement with regard, like, for instance, I listened to Barry Weiss today, and she had a really good take on what's going on in the Ukraine. It wasn't as, again, there isn't a lot of really good answers to that. And she didn't really provide so much as that, but she had a good perspective on it. And I think, honestly, if you look back at the 60s and you look back and you look now today, we don't no longer in this field of psychology, for instance, we no longer have Freud, we no longer have primal scream therapy, we have no longer being affronted by reality. We have cognitive behavioral therapy. We have a lot of really excellent objectivists in the field of psychology, including Gina Gorlin, Ed Locke. I'm missing some people. But
we have several really good therapists working today, and even some good academics who are top of the field, like Ed Locke. Yes, that's a very positive sign.
It's a very positive sign, and it's a sign that people are not being they're not running away from reality. They want facts, they want reality, they want to understand, they want to know, they want to reason, and people are looking for answers. And honestly, right now, I remember Leonard Peikoff saying this, 20 years ago. Now is a cultural vacuum right now. This is the prime time to speak out to people. This is when we talk to people now. we just don't throw up our hands and say everyone's unreasonable, I'm giving up. No. You talk to people.
Exactly right, though, Amy. You're exactly right. These are exactly the teachable moments. When you have inflation, when you have crime running rampant, and now when you've got a serious war in Europe going on for the first time in quite a while, those are the moments that should get people's attention and cause people to think through their fundamentals. And as Ayn Rand loved to say, check their premises.
Yes.
This is a time to check our premises so that we know what we know and we know what we're doing when we do it. And the only way to do that is reason, the power of reason. And it is this neo-mystical assault on reason, on civilization that characterized the 60s that really is the enemy. It's really not the friend. Whatever policy agreements we may have with the hippies, Vietnam War, or women getting jobs in industry, those are superficial, utterly superficial compared to the fundamental assault on reason and civilization that the cultural thrust of the 60s actually represented.
Yeah, so Leonard Peikoff makes a wonderful point in this essay that Immanuel Kant is the culprit here. He's the evildoer. And as he put the Kantian movements are in their death throes, but he said that what he meant by death, the death of a philosophy means its withdrawal from the realms, which in the long run determine the course of human existence, the realm of cognition and the realm of values. So, the Kantian movement, Kantian ideology, and all of its variants coming down, through Germany and then through the United States, it's in its death throes. It's you could say it's dead.
Very few academic philosophers today who are explicit Kantians.
Mm-hmm.
Very few. Very few people are Kantian in their metaphysics, right? And a lot of criticism of Kant's ethics can be found out there too. But the fact that a philosopher has in effect been rejected does not mean that his influence is over.
Right.
At all. This ghost of his premises can continue and linger on long after him. The next greatest philosopher after Kant was a guy named Hegel, who said, well, geez, if we can't know things in themselves, then why do we believe in this noumenal world at all? There is no world apart from our consciousness. It's all pure idealism in his mind. So there was no reality. In effect, Hegel dispensed with the reality that Kant had initially, in effect, dispensed with. So if things get worse from Kant, if people are explicitly rejecting Kant but going for nothing better, but just some retread or some effect of Kant, it's still the domination of irrationality and the assault on the Enlightenment that Kant was.
Yep. So here's our chance. Let's reintroduce reason and Aristotelian logic, and yes, all of that.
It really is. It's Aristotle. It's Aristotle and Ayn Rand.
Yes, it's our time to shine.
It is, and this is certainly a teachable moment. One thing that is sort of encouraging is that when we have these moments of political crisis, sales of Ayn Rand books spike. And I suspect we're on the verge of seeing another big spike in sales of Ayn Rand books, if I can look at the bright side of these kind of crises, because inevitably they do cause people, at least some people, to try and check their premises and look for the deeper ideological roots of these things.
It's interesting that when this book came out, titled The Ominous Parallels, it has the whole case both for what happened in Nazi Germany and what the parallels are to what had been happening in America up until the present time. The book has recently been re-released as The Rise of Hitler's Germany. And what I wouldn't want people to do is look at that new edition and not realize that just the final two chapters of this book, the analysis of America from the turn of the century through the present time, which again gives rise to the ominous parallels between now and Nazi Germany. But just by themselves, those two chapters are such a fantastic analysis of the history of philosophy in America, and ties in so many ways to the way Ayn Rand described the importance of ideas, that if you haven't read this book yet and you think, well, maybe it's a little dated, it's so good. And again,
dated. Let me ask a simple question. This is the 40th anniversary. Back when that book, I was 19 years old when that book came out. And I remember people telling me, oh, how unreal. He's saying that fascism is coming to America? Can you believe that? That's absurd. America's not going to go the way of the Weimar Republic towards some kind of Nazi or fascist future. I will ask a simple question of all of our viewers. Have both parties moved more in the authoritarian and fascist direction since then, or have they moved away from it? Are liberals more inclined to be in favor of free speech? Do they complain when they don't get a chance to talk anymore? Are they more authoritarian and using the willing to use the arms of criminal prosecution or the government against their political foes than they were? Yes. Have the Republicans gotten more principled about freedom or rights, or less so? Have they thrown out their former, at least nominal, defense of freedom, a liberal immigration policy, free trade, no tariffs? No, they've thrown all of those principles out in favor of a more governmental authoritarian. But Trump is in effect a nationalist. Right? The leftists are in effect internationalists, but both of them are more authoritarian, less for individual rights, less for freedom and the American sense of life.
And
Dr.
really,
Peikoff was prescient. He predicted this fascist move on both sides, which we've experienced in the last 40 years. He nailed it.
And what's extraordinary is in the last few years, you actually hear of the word fascist, not just used by extremists out during a riot, but average, ordinary Americans can see this is, of course, they can only see it in the other party, but the word is no longer verboten. We can see this is fascism. And people recognize that, at least in the other party, the word is out there because it's the right word.
How about Prime Minister Trudeau in boring, nice Canada?
Yeah.
You know, I used to associate Canada with, the nicest, easy to get along with people, sweet as pie.
Can't happen here.
Now I'm associating it with a kind of burgeoning fascism.
Yeah.
Trudeau's reaction, I mean, we can debate the truckers and what they were doing. I mean, they were blocking traffic. I mean, I don't think it was anything compared to the violence of our 2020 riots, in America.
It only seemed shocking because it was Canada.
Right. That was a shocker. Now, I know Canada has never been quite as free or as, connected to individual rights as America has been, but nonetheless, is sort of shocking to me that friendly, nice Canada has taken a distinctly authoritarian turn, where a term like fascism is no longer mere hyperbole. They're on a trajectory towards fascism.
I need to read one more thing from Leonard Peikoff's essay here. Okay, so this is basically talking about, when the rebels became ugly in the 60s, and it says, within the limits of their power, people acted on the knowledge that America was going in the wrong course. They rebelled against, for the time being put down, the new breed of rebels, smashing the political hopes of the new left, along with the presidential candidacy of its fellow traveler, George McGovern, some, including thousands of New York City construction workers and longshoresmen, even took to the streets to break up mobs of unruly student protesters. It's just very interesting that you've got truckers today who are protesting the mandate in Canada. And then back then you have, I don't know, it's just kind of it strikes me as you've got people who know what's wrong, but they don't exactly know what to do.
But still, there's that sense of life response that you've got to admire. And you saw that in the Tea Party. A lot of people like to say, oh, that's all gone. It's not all gone.
Right.
Even the supporters of Donald Trump, who I'm no fan of, but at least there's that sense of life reaction. He quotes the construction worker here. I don't care if a person stands on a street corner and tells everybody, I don't like the Vietnam War. I don't like it either, said an elevator constructor in Brooklyn, explaining why he was taking part in the demonstrations. But when they try to ruin the country and desecrate the flag, I can't stand it. Now that's sense of life terms. He
That's
doesn't,
sense of
it's
life.
not the ideas. It's just, he can look at the flag and he can see there's something important there.
Oh man, if we could chuck all of the politicians in Washington and replace them with a random selection of truck drivers, I think America would have much sounder policy.
Yes.
Oh, it reminds me of I did a television interview with Dr. Leonard Peikoff back in 1995, Ideas in Action, and I remember we were discussing the process of getting a PhD in the intellectual environment of the 1990s, and Dr. Peikoff had a very, very funny line. He said, if you're asking me who I'd rather have lunch with, I would take any truck driver, sight unseen, over any PhD to have lunch with, you know, if I couldn't read a book or something. So yeah, it's the academics that are the enemies here, and the truck drivers who still tend to be, at least on a sense of life level, the ones defending America, freedom, and in a common sense way, reason.
Outstanding. Yeah. And of course, Ayn Rand wrote about that in her essay, Don't Let It Go. I think most objectivists are familiar with it. If you haven't read that article, as soon as we get done today, that's your next assignment, Don't Let It Go, in which she talked about the American sense of life, the implicit ideas and that meta-ethical sense that people have, that this is a different country, it's a great country, it's the kind of country where you can live your own life for your own sake, where people are reasonable, if not explicitly rational, and appreciate the value of reason, of what science and technology and the products of reason have made possible. I think that's still here. I think it's the only explanation for example, Steven Pinker's thesis that everything is getting better all the time, because in so many ways things seem to be getting worse all the time. and to reread Don't Let It Go and to realize, you know, what she was telling us, don't let values go, don't let that American sense of life go, and to realize that struggle is still happening right now. And then to get to be a part of the Ayn Rand Center UK and the Ayn Rand Institute and organizations that are actually fighting, not just like the Tea Party did, as valuable as that was to clamp down on the Obama administration, but explicitly for these ideas that can, and in many ways already have, saved the world. That's exciting. And rereading Leonard Peikoff's essay really just drives it home, makes me appreciate that, makes me look at the 60s with a much more nuanced view, and makes me want to fight some more.
Yeah, a sense of life is just something we experience on an emotional level. By itself, it can't fight the onslaught of ideas, can't fight the onslaught of philosophy and all of its manifestations. And so in the long run, a sense of life at some point will give out against the weight of hostile ideas. And it needs getting back to yeah, exactly. Getting back to what the Ayn Rand Institute does and what the Ayn Rand Center UK does, I should say we, are the ones who are providing a rational, principled alternative. It isn't just hey, let's go back to some folksy Cracker Barrel religious kind of old-fashioned wisdom. That is not the solution. The solution is not going back, nor is the solution going forward into some world of irrationality and collectivism. The alternative is a philosophy of reason and individualism, and a principled approach to this. And that's really, in the long run, it's the only hope for Western culture.
Very well said, as always, Jimmy.
Oh, thanks. I'm just paraphrasing the greats, my heroes, Ayn Rand and Leonard Peikoff. Yeah, we've covered some really great essays and books here today that everyone should really check out. There is so much material out there related to this very topic. And I urge everyone to check it out. And just as I urge everyone, if they can, to become a subscriber to the Ayn Rand Center UK. Subscriptions start at only £10 a month, and you get all kinds of benefits. If you enjoy this kind of content, there's content that's not available except to subscribers. Don Watkins' Communication Bootcamp by itself is worth the price of admission. So I would urge you to help us in our ongoing effort to provide the world a philosophy of reason and individualism. And if you find this stuff educational and helpful, please subscribe. Hit like, hit share, hit subscribe.
Yes.
And please join
Yeah.
us in our efforts.
Yeah, and maybe we can all do some 60s dancing later on.
That's right.
Right.
Do that.
Exactly.
We're not collectivists, but we are memberists. So AynRandCenter.co.uk/membership and become a member. Like us, all the cool kids are doing it.
We are the real individualists. We are
That's
the
right.
real advocates of personal freedom, but
That's
we base it on reason. We have a morality of reason. We're not throwing reason out in favor of LSD and crystals and New Age mysticism. That's the big difference here.
Oh, yeah. And consequently, we're able to work together in ways the collectivists can't dream of.
Can't dream of.
True.
It's true.
Very true.
Well, outstanding. Well, I feel better about the 60s because I not only know what was good about the 60s, but I know what was bad about the 60s. And as Leonard Peikoff points out, we know that the answer is ideas. These ideas, the right ideas. Thank you so much for the discussion, James. It was, as always, enlightening and inspiring.
And fun. You guys are
Yes.
great. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Take care.
You too.